Ohar,
Here.
Commissioner Felder,
Here.
Commissioner O'Neill,
Here.
and Chair Wellender.
Here.
Mr.
now that we-
Ohar is now the vice chair. That's interesting.
When did I become the vice chair?
Oh, boy. Sorry. I just promoted you.
Okay, I'm going to demote him. Larry, you're back in.
Thank you.
So with the visual on our screen, let's go ahead and pay respects and pledge allegiance, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag
Flag
of the United States of America
And to
and
the
to the
republic
Republic
for which
for
it
which
stands,
stands
One
one
nation.
nation, under God,
indivisible,
indivisible, with liberty
and
and
justice.
justice for all. Very good. All right. With a little bit of formality, we are continuing to be virtual, and as a result, the public has an opportunity to participate. They can view online. They can also submit comments via email, or they can have virtual participation. So I hope the word is out and that we still get public participation. With that said, we're going to move on to comments from the public not appearing on this evening's agenda. So Wendy, do we have anybody in the queue?
Well, I would note that any correspondence that was received prior to the meeting was posted in the document center on the city's website. And I see no public comments in the email, and no one is raising their hand at this time.
Very good.
I have a comment about the documents that are on the city website. At least looking on the city's iPad that I've been provided with, I cannot open the full PDF on my iPad. It tells me to click to open the PDF, but then it doesn't open the PDF. All I get is page 1, and I can see no subsequent pages. So I'm really not sure what the problem is, but something is awry.
I'll email all the comments to you right now.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
And I'm going to second that. I had the same thing happen.
You know, I'm beginning to get a sense that everybody would like to go back to hard paper, forget the electronics, forget computers. Let's get the telephone back. I'd love that. So anyway, so we have late correspondence posted, and I do believe we're moving right along to our first presentation by W-Trans regarding Senate Bill 743. So Wendy, I'll let you invite, give up.
Sure, I'll turn it over to Christina to introduce Barry Bergman from W-Trans.
Very good. Thank you.
Give Barry a second to get on. All right, there's Barry. I actually haven't seen him face to face yet, so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Barry works for W-Trans. W-Trans is a local transportation planning firm out of Santa Rosa, and I'll let Barry say a little bit more, but the city works with W-Trans very often. They're a really great asset to the city, and I've asked Barry to come tonight to give an overview of vehicle miles traveled and how it applies to CEQA analysis and some challenges and issues that the city of Sonoma might be facing. We've had a shift in how CEQA traffic impacts have been analyzed over the last few years, shifting from level of service to VMT. And I will let the expert give everyone some more information. So Barry, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to come down. This something that Sonoma and of course the rest of the state is dealing with right now, and a lot of folks, I think some cities kind of got out ahead of the curve, but most are scrambling and running to catch up and trying to figure out how to best deal with this. And I'm just going to go into a kind of a description, so I hope I can share my screen. Is that working?
Yes.
Excellent.
Indeed.
Okay, so I'm just going to start by kind of going over the legislation, the way things that have been done up until recently, what the new VMT world means, and then just to focus a little more on specific examples of what impacts might look like, what kind of strategy can be used to mitigate, and where some of those challenges might come from. So SB 743, it stated that level of service, the measure of traffic delay, is no longer considered to be an environmental impact under CEQA. That's something that's still a lot of cities and communities are continuing to use, but not as part of the CEQA process. Instead, the transportation impacts are to be measured in terms of vehicle miles traveled generated by the project, and I'll get a bit more to that. But just to kind of sum up the distinction between the two is that level of service measures the impact of projects on drivers, the delay, whereas VMT measures the impact of driving on the broader environment. And this provision went into effect July 1st of last year. So the intent of SB 743 to more appropriately balance the needs of congestion management with statewide goals related to infill development, promotion of public health through active transportation, and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So far broader than looking at just the delay piece. What are the implications of looking at delay? This is kind of one of the, I guess, unintended consequences is that LOSA is no delay at all. LOSF has plenty of congestion, but there's a lot of other aspects to the community that just don't get factored into that equation that make it a desirable place. So just to illustrate a little bit like what the implications are of concentrating development or developing more in an infill setting as opposed to a greenfield setting. This first example shows in kind of a dense grid in a downtown type area, when you have development where the traffic impacts, it's a relatively less traffic, but you often get numerous level of service impacts because of that concentration. If you're developing a greenfield way out on the periphery, there's more traffic, but it's much more dispersed. So you end up with very limited level of service impact, but you end up with broader contribution to regional traffic congestion. And so what we have here, that's interesting to do that when I did it before. So what you can end up with is a situation like this, where you have a 45-minute commute, which includes 5 minutes of congestion, which gives you a good level of service grade. And that gives you what is called, we talk about access versus mobility. So access means access to various goods and services, things that you might need on a day-to-day basis, whereas mobility is just your ability to travel. So level of service, delay measures more about ability to travel, and VMT approach focuses more on access. So you might have a shorter commute, more congestion, good access, but a poor level of service grade. So what are the implications of having used level of service in the past? Infill development, you ended up with a relatively congested area, and then those last projects that came in ended up tripping the balance and getting into an unacceptable level of service grade, so they end up having to pay those mitigations. You end up with an induced demand, so as roadway capacity is increased, people see that there's less delay on the road and they change their travel patterns, and often that capacity gets used up pretty quickly. As far as environmental impacts, it creates an emphasis more on automobile use. We have runoff, there's various other kinds of impacts, and that contributes to health impacts and also just the higher maintenance costs of dealing with additional roadway. So what is VMT? Pretty simple. As a definition, it's the number of trips times the trip length, and you get vehicle miles traveled. And so in order to reduce VMT, you need to reduce the number of trips, either by having people be able to use other modes of transportation, or reduce the trip length. So having more compact development means if people are driving, they're still traveling a shorter distance. So by changing this metric to focus on VMT, it provides more encouragement for infill development to enhance multimodal transportation, to reduce vehicle trips, reducing those environmental impacts, supporting active transportation, because now people will have access to more goods and services in proximity to where they are, and then other impacts on in terms of safety and maintenance. And so one of the things that you'll see in your work is that places where a project you might have seen impact from an LOS point of view is going to show up differently when you evaluate it in terms of VMT. So this document here is kind of the go-to as far as how to deal with VMT. This was put out by the Office of Planning and Research, and it has some guidance. There are some things that are more specific than others. They really left it pretty open for customization, for interpretation, to allow for unique circumstances of projects and how they are in different communities. So the data used for VMT generally relies on travel demand models. So in this case, for the Sonoma County Transportation Authority, the lead agency is the one that actually establishes the thresholds, as with other parts of CEQA. And then this document from OPR does have guidance, which you can use those as your thresholds, which at this point, I think most of the communities we've interacted with have been doing, at least for the time being. If you want to establish your own thresholds, then there has to be some kind of evidence to support that.
Can you remind me what OPR means?
Sorry, Office of Planning and Research, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research.
Thank you.
We have too many acronyms in our field. So just as far as how do we apply, just looking at the OPR guidance and what the thresholds are that they have put out there, to avoid a detailed VMT analysis and dealing with the modeling, they have recommended screening criteria. So for small projects, if they generate less than 110 trips a day, that's something that can be said to be assumed to be a less than significant impact. A lot of places are developing a map-based screening tool. And so that's something I believe SCTA is working on one. I know Santa Rosa has one. But what they've done is they've taken the travel characteristics at the traffic analysis zone level. So it's I don't know what size it is, but it's I'll show you a map. I'll show you a map later on, which will show what the traffic analysis zones look like in Sonoma. But looking at the travel characteristics from the model, you can see which areas are lower or higher VMT. And the assumption is that if a project is in one of those areas, that the VMT from the project will be similar to that of existing development. Local serving retail. Retail projects that are over 50,000 square feet are considered to be regional serving, so they could increase VMT by attracting people from a longer distance, whereas less than 50,000 square feet, it's generally considered to be redistributing existing traffic or enabling people to make shorter trips to get where they want to go. Then there's proximity to high quality transit, which they've defined as within a half a mile of a rail station or major bus routes. And then affordable housing at infill locations, 100% affordable housing is considered to be less than significant, and but also potentially some with partial affordable housing. But again, these are general statements. There are some additional, more specific criteria attached to that. So as far as how the guidance would be applied, what it looks at is VMT is expressed as a rate. So you have VMT per capita for residential projects and per worker for employment-based projects or office. And since if you look at absolute VMT, any development will increase. So what they're looking at is how, if that rate, how that compares with the baseline. And the baseline can either be the city or county or region. And I'll show you a little bit about what that looks like. In the case of, for residential development and for office development, the threshold that's been established through the guidance, 15% below the baseline for VMT per capita for residential, 15% below the baseline for VMT per employee for employment based. So there may be the average VMT already there for a particular zone, but the project needs to get 15% below that to have no significant impact for or less than significant impact.
And excuse me, can you
Yes.
remind me as to how the baseline is established?
Yeah, so the baseline is for, you can select what is appropriate. And so that's something that could be done differently for different communities. In Sonoma, the residential VMT per capita is relatively quite high. So for example, if you use the countywide average as a baseline, it's going to be extremely difficult to get any project that won't have an impact because the average is already considerably higher than the countywide level. So if you use the citywide level, then you're comparing new projects to what's already in place in the city. So it gives you more likely that you won't have something to mitigate.
But the baseline is a quantitative number, correct?
Yes, it's something generated in this case by the Sonoma County travel demand model.
Yeah, Barry, if I could just interrupt, this is David, the planning director, to follow up on
Yes.
Larry's comment. And I know that you really wanted to get through your presentation first, but it's a really critical point here because in this case, Sonoma County is the regional number. And because you've got urban areas like Santa Rosa, they have a lot less of a VMT. And that's what Barry's trying to explain here is that because we're remote, we travel much more. Therefore, because we're lumped into that regional number, we're not going to ever get places that are probably even going to meet the 15% VMT. It's going to be very difficult.
Now, but on the other hand, the with office, using a citywide average is problematic because of where the workplace draws employees from. So that's something that, from what we've been hearing, that's something that needs to be looked at using the countywide average. But the city's average VMT per employee is much closer to the countywide average than it is for residential. So it's not as much of a hurdle as it would be on the residential side.
And one last question, Barry. Actually, that wasn't a question before, but the statement on it. But are you going to? I scanned through the slides earlier. I don't remember now, and I apologize for that. But are you going to talk about how projects can mitigate to get to an acceptable VMT, even if they don't make the 15%? Or is that going to come through Q&A? Do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to show some examples. I mean, it obviously is going to be pretty, but I'm going to show some examples that I think would be particularly relevant.
Right, thank you. Sorry.
And then for retail, so while that 15% applies to the residential and to the office uses, for retail, it's just looking at the net increase or decrease. So that's kind of different. I mean, there you're dealing with customers, you're dealing with employees, but that's the measure that OPR has recommended. So there are certain, we talked about retail and office and residential, but then there are other uses that has to be done on a customized basis. But also a lot of what this SB 743 has been directed to is really more urbanized areas, and the applications there are a lot more obvious why the intent about compact development and serving transit and things like that apply very well to metropolitan areas. So communities like Sonoma and rural communities, there are often some challenges when we've been coming up against that in some of our work. One of some examples of what those are. So visitor related travel. I think hotels are one example in particular where you have most of the VMT related to the project is from visitors as opposed to employees. And then how do you figure out where visitors are coming from? So anyway, there are things to look at as far as the individual circumstances around the project. If you have for example, a project that is adding one more hotel to an area where there are lots of hotels and there may be nothing unusual about it, you could just be redistributing the existing visitors to another hotel and not really adding any VMT. If it's something that's more of a destination, that could be attracting more VMT. So it really is a project specific thing that needs to be looked at. So also rural communities, or say edge communities, areas that may be bordering on a community outside, so it's not as much concentrated development. Some of the facilities may not be quite in place that could support a low VMT environment. So, and I'll get into that a little bit more when I talk about what some of the mitigations could be. But in rural and edge communities, there are things like there's fewer transit services available, so it doesn't meet that that screening criteria that you'd be able to use in a more urbanized area. There are different mitigation options that are appropriate or that'll work. So just to compare, just to go back to level of service again, the differences that you'll see in mitigations, when you looked at EIRs before, level of service is mitigated by adding travel lanes, adding turn pockets, signalizing an intersection. For VMT, you end up with very different kinds of mitigations where you're changing the land use, perhaps adding a retail component to a residential component, or adding affordable housing to a single family housing project. Building sidewalks, adding bicycle infrastructure, transportation demand management programs, or modified parking strategies are some of those measures. So this is kind of the Bible for dealing with mitigations. This report is based on research that was put out. It's getting a little dated at this point, but I understand there's research in the works to keep it more current. But this is what kind of the established document is that is as a reference. So there's a long list of mitigations that are in here, and it's very context sensitive. So when you look at it, there is a wide range of percentage reductions you can get depending on the measure and how well it suits the project and what the potential is for mitigating. So I just listed here the categories of mitigations, and then under each of these, there's numerous examples. So between land use, parking, trip reduction programs, all of that.
What's road pricing?
That's something they list in there, but that's more like toll lanes, things like that. So not something that would be applicable here, but they have a full range of things available. But in general, I'd say it's very difficult to mitigate more than 15%. So if your project has VMT that's 20% higher, in theory, you could probably do it, but it would be so expensive as to not make it worthwhile. So that's just kind of a general guideline. This is one page from that document. So the measure that they have here is increased transit accessibility. And I've highlighted here, you can see the range of effectiveness is 0.5 to 24.6%. So it's a pretty big range. And so obviously it really needs to be customized to the specific circumstance. With the transit service in Sonoma, 24.6% reduction is not realistic. It's much more toward the lower end given the frequency of the service and the number of routes and where they go. So that's just something to keep in mind if you see the big numbers. This is a map. This is from the the travel demand model. And so if you see that's Broadway coming up the middle there, you might not be able to read that. And so the green these zones are, you can see there are VMT numbers there, VMT per capita, so that's for residential projects. The VMT per capita for Sonoma is 30.16. And
is that the baseline you were talking about?
Yes. So that's the baseline, and then the threshold would be 15% below that.
Right. And
so these cells that are colored in green, they are below that threshold. So in these areas, that would be something that would likely not have to be mitigated for a residential project. The yellow cells are below the average, but they didn't make that 15% cut. So there'd be some level of mitigation required to get them 15% below. And then that orange area is above 15%, is above the average. And so to get 15% below required a really substantial mitigation. It's unlikely that would be possible. So then it would probably have to go to an EIR. So just thinking about Sonoma in particular, as I said, this is really using the SCTA model is certainly better than some of the other areas that we've looked at. So I think they're pretty far along in this. So you're fortunate in that regard. And it's more fine-grained than some of the other models. In some cases, we've had to use, there's a statewide model or there's an MTC model, but for especially for a city the size of Sonoma, it's good to have the more precise information. Identifying appropriate mitigations is going to be a challenge. Like I said, something like transit is going to be of limited value. It'll be something you can get, something from transit access, from building sidewalks, from improving bicycle facilities, bicycle parking, various other kinds of things. But it will take some going through and like I said, looking at the specific needs of the project. And then I mentioned the land uses that are not addressed in the OPR guidance, and that is something that requires a pretty customized approach. There are some that you might be able to say, oh, well, that behaves similar to a retail project or similar to an office project. But then there are some that are just completely unique and, where you have employees, you have visitors. I was talking to a colleague and looking at a project like a fire station, or I know we had a project that was a cemetery, and there are things that are just very unique that is not going to easily fit into one of these categories. But anyway, at this point, it's definitely an evolving art form, and I'm sure as we learn more, as we go through, as more data becomes available, then these things are going to be getting a little clearer. So that's, I guess I shouldn't stop yet. I don't know if anyone had any questions or wanted me to refer back to any slides.
I just have one basic question, which is, if I understand things correctly, then this this traffic evaluation approach can be itself a mitigation of having to do an EIR. In other words, within the parameters of this analysis, this 15% you're talking about, a project application would not trigger an EIR based on the traffic analysis.
If you can get to that, below that threshold, right?
Yes.
That's correct.
And is that an automatic exception to an EIR? In other words, is this now codified in state law that if you can stay within that 15% mitigation figure, that you are not required and can't be required to do an EIR?
Well, this only is the traffic impact or transportation impact, I should say. It's not.
Yes.
And it depends on what the thresholds are that are being used. So like I said, the city may elect to have its own thresholds. If you're applying the Office of Planning Research thresholds, then I would say you do have to be, like I said, it's 15%, but sometimes there are certain qualifiers. So you do need to look at each thing individually and get into the details of the guidance. But I think in general, I would say yes. If you're able to get below that threshold, that's considered a less than significant impact.
Okay, thank you.
What we would do there, Barry, is we do that analysis as a part of the initial study to determine whether an EIR would be required or if a negative declaration would be prepared.
2 questions, please. Question number 1 is, is that technical advisory guideline worth requesting a copy in terms of, is it in layman's terms or is it in a language that I may not recognize?
It's a good question. I think it's pretty accessible, and they do reference things. So if there are things that they cite in there, you should be able to look them up. So I think it's handy. It's certainly handy to have, and you may want to have someone interpret some things. But in general, I think it's pretty accessible. It's something you can get online and at the Office of Planning and Research website.
Great, thank you. And my second question has to do specifically with SB 743. Because we are a rural community, as I sat listening to your presentation, it sounded like maybe we're not being penalized, but that the parameters that have been established are less, not relevant, but have the small communities just been lumped into the whole So once again, our beloved politicians have made these sweeping generalizations, and we're just having to deal with it because we're a rural community.
I mean, I wouldn't go that far. I do think Sonoma is certainly better positioned than some that we've seen. I think the ones that are more isolated and don't have a well-developed downtown or concentration of mixed uses and commercial development are having a significantly difficult time. In a lot of these cases, it can be really difficult to avoid an EIR. And so I think that's something that's still sort of getting fleshed out. Like I said, there are fewer mitigations that are available to Sonoma than there would be in other places. I think it kind of remains to be seen exactly what the impacts are and what kind of projects come in and what part of the city they're located in. It's really those two things. It's the type of project and where it's located.
I'm not intentionally misleading. I do have a third question, and that is there going to be some sort of metric or evaluation that says, okay, we heard what the intent is of SB 743, but would there be some point down the road that we'll be able to actually quantify whether or not it does what the politicians think it's supposed to do?
I imagine, I mean, I don't know if there's any plans to do any kind of, for example, a report card. I mean, they are doing things like tracking greenhouse gas emissions, and so I imagine they'll be linked to something like that where it would show.
Okay, very good. Anyone else have questions for Barry? All right, I see none. Just because you're on vacation, Christina, doesn't mean you can still ask questions.
I am just happy to have Barry here and learn from him, and hope everybody got a little bit of information tonight. And I'm sure we'll have to revisit this topic in the future. Thank you so much, Barry. David, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you, Barry. One comment, and without going down this rabbit hole, if you'll indulge me for a minute, but this type of analysis is exactly what we're going to be doing for a project in town, and a certain land use that Barry addressed that relates to visitors and places of lodging. I'll just leave it like that. And it was somewhat cryptic, but I think you all know what I'm talking about. And then secondly, Christina, if you'd be so kind to forward the OPR link to the commissioners, and that way they can access it on the guidance, that'd be superb. And again, thank you, Barry, for joining us tonight.
Sure.
And
Actually, I was just going to say one more thing. If anyone's interested in kind of diving into this in more detail, on the OPR site, they do have a lot of other resources, webinars, things like that. It's probably way more information than you want, but if you are really into it, then you have the opportunity to dive right in.
Great.
And it looks like we have a hand raised. I'm not sure how we handle comments and questions with something like this, David.
I don't know what the hand raised thing is.
Well, there's a member of the public that would like to comment on the presentation.
That'd be up to the chair. That'd be fine.
That'd be fine.
Okay, so you're going to open the item up to the public?
Sure. Let's open up the item to the public.
Great. Fred Allabach, you may speak.
Thank you, Chair Wellender, for your discretion of letting me give my 2 cents here. This was very interesting, certainly worth mastering this as far as how it's going to affect the project. One of the things that occurred to me is that that smart growth equals congestion, and it means people are using relatively scarce space up, and so with vehicle miles traveled, that would theoretically be less. But in a place like Sonoma, I've been doing informal study for years of people who make, say, 60% area median income and less, and almost all of them say that they all shop out of town because it's too expensive to shop here. So that Sonoma is not just small and rural, but it's also pretty wicked expensive. And so that, I think that the Sonoma baseline should take into account, what the food and goods prices are here for actually healthy food. Like, you could get less expensive food here if you shopped at the dollar store, but that wouldn't be where you would want people to shop a lot. So, even Safeway, you can get savings of $4 to $5 an item by going to the Santa 101 corridor or to Napa, just from Safeway. So I think that should be worked into Sonoma's baseline for vehicle miles traveled. And so that seems what it seems to do with vehicle miles traveled. Then, if for example, that would result in a higher VMT, that Sonoma had a baseline that resulted in more travel for people to shop, then that would seem to lock in the inflated value of prices here, and that affordable housing then would actually mean more vehicle miles traveled because more people would have to go to shop elsewhere. So that's just a few thoughts that I had on this. That's kind of my thing. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Fred. Anyone else from the public?
No additional public comment.
I'd like to then bring it back to the commission. And maybe just express again, thank you very much, Barry. Appreciate that. And we'll let you go and enjoy your evening.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, before we go on with our the rest of our agenda tonight, I would like to introduce, and Wendy, if you can promote David Rudiman, please, I'd appreciate it. Mr. Chair, David Rudiman, and Commissioners, David Rudiman, we're going to call him D5. Yes, there are 5 Davids now that we know here in the city of Sonoma. And David is joining us from Jeff Walter's new firm, Colantuono, and there's 2 other names there too. David, you can tell us Watley is one of them, but I can never get the. I feel pretty good that I got Colantuono right, but David is joining us and will be helping us on land use matters, and will also be working with our ad hoc committee on the development code and some of the housing element stuff. So, David, if you just say hi and introduce yourself, please.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm David Ruderman. Colantuono, Highsmith, and Watley is our firm name. D2 gave the appropriate Italian pronunciation of Colantuono, which is appreciated by our managing shareholder. But yes, I'm happy to dive right in and help out the Planning Commission. I'm a native of Sonoma County, although I now reside up in the foothills.
Thank you, David.
Very good.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Welcome, David. Okay, moving right along to our consent calendar. We have a very brief agenda this evening. Would anyone like to speak to a change, or do we find it acceptable? I'm hearing nothing.
I'll make a motion to approve the consent calendar.
Great. Is there a second?
Second.
Roll call, please.
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Barnett, sorry, Vice Chair Barnett.
Aye.
Commissioner Bohar,
Aye.
Commissioner Felder,
He's muted.
oh. I think he said aye.
Aye again.
Commissioner O'Neill
Yes.
and Chair Wellender.
Yes.
Thank you. The motion passes unanimously.
Okay, then we're going to slip right into our public hearing portion of the agenda, and that will be item 9.1. And I do believe it will be continued. Wendy, would you like to offer any other comments regarding this item?
No, just we're working on an environmental report, and it wasn't completed in time to make it for this meeting. So hopefully we'll be on board for the commission to consider the item in May.
Very good. So I would like to solicit a motion to be continued, please.
Move to continue.
Second.
All right.
Do we want to make it to a date certain?
Yes, May
Yes,
15th.
To the next
Okay.
meeting, May, please.
I'm sorry, come again?
That would be to the meeting in May. Your regular meeting in May.
Okay. Very good. So with that in mind, do we have a roll call, please?
Yes, Vice Chair Barnett,
Aye.
Commissioner Bohar,
Aye.
Commissioner Felder,
Aye.
Commissioner O'Neill,
Yep.
and Chair Wellender.
Yes,
Thank you. The motion passes unanimously.
excellent. So we're moving right along to item 9.2, which is regarding the review and possible adoption or recommended adoption to the city council regarding our affordable housing. Before we get started, I just want to make a couple of comments. This topic has been brought to the ad hoc committee, and we have discussed it, I believe, twice. There was no general consensus on it, but we felt it was appropriate to bring it to the full commission, and so we are doing that this evening. And I also would like to clarify that our goal is not to fast track, push something through, but the goal is to have a thoughtful and thorough discussion. And should we find ourselves not able to complete that this evening, we can certainly continue it. And again, it has been suggested that we are also wanting to hear from the public and the possibility of from some actual building professionals such as DeNova or Steve Letson. So that would be something that I believe we would all welcome. So with that in mind, I will let the individual who is on vacation speak to this item.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I can just, before we turn it over to Christina.
Yes.
She does have a PowerPoint, and I'm sure she'll tell you that we can send this PowerPoint out to you after the meeting and also to the public that would like to see it. It's something that she was able to prepare during her vacation, AIF. And I do want to make a comment about the inclusionary housing ordinance that you got before you on your packet. And I made a mistake in instructing Christina on one of the pieces, and she'll get into it in a little bit. And that is regarding the direction of the ad hoc. And you mentioned, Mr. Chair, that it wasn't unanimous, but it was at least the majority of the people on the ad hoc wanted to at least begin the discussion in the public forum. And as you said, if we get through it tonight, great. If we don't, that's great too. What we need to do is make sure that we get the right fit for our community. In preparing the percentages, if you will, our current ordinance has a 20%. Most of you know that, and you've heard it for 20 odd years. And that basically caters to the 10% moderate and 10% low income. And the ad hoc provided a recommendation that I failed to capture for Christina, and that was a 5% LI, a 10% moderate, 10%, and a 10% in a category called the missing middle, or which is otherwise called 140% of AMI. And Christina can kind of go into those income brackets later. But what I do want to emphasize, if there's one thing you remember tonight, when it comes to the world of HCD, and you've heard of the word RHNA before, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, Regional Housing Needs, the RHNA, there's only 4 categories that we get assigned a number. And it begins with very low income, moderate, and above moderate. So when we get that 330 number, which is the current number that's out there in the world today, when it becomes rock solid, and that's our assigned number for the next 8 years in the 6th cycle, and I know that doesn't sound right, cycle number 6, we're going to get given so many units out of that 330 in just those 4 categories, those household income categories. Again, VLI, LI, mod, and above mod. And so I'll leave it at that for now and turn the time over to Christina.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. I only have one screen today, so I'm hoping my screen share is gonna work okay. Wendy, if I have trouble, will you will you help me out? All right. All right, can you guys see my presentation, or can you just see the slide?
We're good.
Okay, great. So thank you all for your continued support going through this task of reviewing our zoning code and making amendments to echo the comments of Chair Willander and Planning Director Spur. My favorite analogy is that of our mayor, Logan Harvey, who sees the ad hoc committee as he wants everything to come out as a soft cookie and not fully baked. And this is really to encourage as much public participation as possible. So the draft ordinance that has been released to the public and for discussion tonight, this is our soft cookie, and we're summarizing a lot of the thoughts and comments of the ad hoc, but want to make sure that everybody has adequate time to come up to speed on all issues housing and understand what piece of that pie that we're talking about. And just to give a quick overview, this is now our third round of updates that we're working on. The first round of zoning code updates went into effect on February 10th. The second round went into effect April 1st. And the topics that are currently being discussed at the ad hoc committee include affordable housing, our fix-it list, which was drafted and reviewed by the Planning Commission in October 2020. Some of the more timely issues that have come up recently are discussing Chapter 1946, fences, hedges, and walls, and Chapter 1208, our tree ordinance. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time tonight to go over the various levels of planning documents that all touch this topic of affordable housing. The ordinance, the affordable housing ordinance that we're talking about is really just one tiny component. So the top layer of planning is our City of Sonoma general plan, and it is the city's blueprint on how to meet this community's future vision for the city. A general plan is required by state law, and it's required to contain 7 elements, which include land use, circulation, housing, conservation, open space, noise, and safety. These are really big, expensive documents, and they're typically updated every 10 to 20 years. As I mentioned, the housing element is one of the 6 required elements. It has a higher level of review and requirements for being updated. So it's being updated more frequently than the general plan itself. Our current housing element was updated adopted on March 15th, 2015, where our general plan was last adopted in 2006. It is required by state to be updated at least every 8 years. Some jurisdictions are required to do it more frequently. The cities is an 8-year period. And then the zoning code is that third level, and the zoning code is what implements the general plan and the housing element. That's where the zoning standards and land use densities, things like that, are contained that implement the goals and policies in the general plan and the housing element. Our zoning code was last comprehensively updated in 2006, but as I mentioned earlier, we are working our way through. And what these first few rounds of updates are really focused on that low-hanging fruit. So this is by no means a comprehensive process. We are going through and trying to tackle the problems that have been the biggest issues that we feel staff and Planning Commission and the ad hoc feel we could tackle in a relatively quick manner. And then we'll be dealing with the more complex topics later on. Affordable housing in the city of Sonoma is an incredibly complex issue. So we're all considering this a first pass. And as we go through our housing element process and get more comprehensive data, that's really going to inform a deeper dive later on. So tonight, what's highlighted in red, we are focusing on Chapter 1944, Affordable Housing and Density Bonus of our zoning code. And just to give talked a little bit about this, I'll go through pretty quickly. Our 2020 general plan contains a community development element, local economy element, environmental resources. Our circulation element was actually updated in 2016, so it's more recent than our general plan. Public safety and noise, and then the housing element is a separate part of that. So if you look at our 2020 general plan online, the housing element and the circulation element are outdated in those documents. These are just some of my favorite quotes from the general plan as it pertains to affordable housing. Sonoma should continue to be characterized by variety in terms of land uses building types and housing, and this diversity should be consistent with preserving the town's small scale and historic nature. The next is new residential development should emulate the desirable characteristics of existing neighborhoods by providing variety in lot and unit sizes and a range of prices, including opportunities for lower income households and respect unique site and neighborhood conditions. And as I mentioned previously, the housing element is a much more stringent and regulated process than the general plan is. We are just about to go through our housing plan update. So the housing element requires the city to demonstrate where housing can be built to meet our regional housing needs allocation. So the California Department of Housing and Community Development determines the total number of new homes the Bay Area needs to build and how affordable the homes need to be in order to meet the housing needs of people at all income levels. So the Bay Area Association of Governments then distributes the regional share to each city, town, or country. And then it's up to the city of Sonoma to demonstrate through its housing element where the housing can be built and identifying the policies and strategies that are necessary to meet the community's needs. So the city is not required to build the housing, but we need to demonstrate through our housing element that the required housing is able to be built and do what we can to facilitate. We recently sent out a request for proposals to find a consultant to help us with our 6th cycle housing element, and we'll hopefully be taking that to City Council shortly. And that will be another great opportunity for members of the public to get engaged and to help the city meet its affordable housing goals. This is a quote from the Department of Housing and Community Development. California housing law acknowledges that in order for the private market to adequately address the housing needs and demand of Californians, local governments must adopt plans and regulatory systems that provide opportunities and do not unduly constrain housing development. As a result, housing policy in California rests largely on the effective implementation of local general plans and particular local housing elements. And so just want to highlight, so we're talking about one teeny part of the puzzle when we're talking about our inclusionary housing ordinance. So these are our RENA numbers for our current cycle. So the goal was to have 12 extremely low, 12 very low, 23 low, 27 moderate, 63 above moderate for a total of 137 units. This is a summary of what we have been able to construct to date. In 2019, we had 4 very low. We had 2 low and 7 in 2018. So we have a total of 4 very low, 9 low, 19 moderate, and 85 above moderate. And this is one of the key pieces of information that staff and the ad hoc committee have been looking at as far as making potential changes to our inclusionary housing ordinance. So as you can see, we have produced far more above moderate than our RENA numbers were requiring and far less very low and low. There are some numbers that have not been reflected. So the Alta Madrona units are not reflected in this yet. I think they'll come for the next cycle, and a couple more developments that had been approved and are in the building permit process but haven't been counted yet. So the zoning code, as I mentioned, is what's implementing the housing element, and it does it by establishing zoning districts, density standards, development standards, and the inclusionary housing requirements. So Chapter 1944, Affordable Housing and Density Bonuses, is the section that we're talking about. It ensures the production of affordable units in new developments by establishing affordable housing requirements on residential projects that meet certain criteria. So it was originally put on the books in 2003 and updated in 2014. The goals of the staff and the ad hoc committee were to improve clarity of the standards, to simplify, to have one standard for all zoning districts, where right now we have different standards for various zoning districts, to better align with our RENA goals and the requirements to provide very low income and low income housing units. One of the goals of the ad hoc was to differentiate standards for rental and ownership units and recognize that there is a substantial need in our community for very low and low income rental units. To implement requirements for developments of 4 units or fewer, we currently only require inclusionary housing for 5 units or more. To implement an in lieu fee for 4 units or less and for fractional units. And also to improve clarity on development standards for affordable units. So in order to bring this draft to you, or the soft cookie, we have gone through quite a lot of work. Started at the staff level of identifying what our ongoing issues were. We reviewed the RENA numbers for the 5th cycle. We spend quite a lot of time looking at other jurisdictions, Healdsburg, Novato, City of Santa Rosa, Sonoma County, Petaluma, City of Novato, and City of Healdsburg. The research was helpful and not helpful. The numbers are all over the map. Our current inclusionary housing ordinance is 20%. Some were more, some were less. Some differentiated between rentals and ownership, some did not. So really, my takeaway was each of the inclusionary housing ordinances really reflect the flavor and the needs of each individual city. And so based on all that work, staff created a draft of the inclusionary housing ordinance and brought that before the ad hoc. The ad hoc committee reviewed the draft as well as the research and had some extensive discussions on what the existing affordable housing issues were and identifying the goals. The draft ordinance was reviewed and with feedback to staff on making modifications. There was another meeting where a second draft of the ordinance was reviewed. We did a comparison of existing market rate and deed restricted units in the city and found that there's a lot of benefits to our program. And the benefits are most notable in the newer developments. And we have a lot of new, beautiful homes that are going in, and they're a huge benefit to our community. On a personal note, I can attest when we approve people for these units, there are often tears, and it's a really wonderful thing to be able to provide our citizens. We had discussions on the size of the unit. Does bigger mean better? As our planning chair loves to note on, perhaps not necessarily the case, as well as affordability. We had lively debates about very low, low, moderate, and do we need to create a new classification between market rate and moderate? The recommendations from the ad hoc committee are part of the draft ordinance, and they include new standards for rental and ownership units. And there was support for reducing the overall percentage of rental units to go down from the current 20% to 15%, but requiring very low income units where currently we have no requirement for very low. And then for ownership units, the support was to raise it to 25% and have a mixed proportion of moderate, low income, and very low. And David, is this a point where you want to chime in on the change?
Yeah, well, like I said at the outset, thanks, Christina. The theory here is the city of Sonoma has a requirement of 20%, and you can it's up to a developer to choose between whether that's 20% of low income or moderate. And as we know historically, not just in this cycle, but for cycles 3, 4, and 5, the one we're in today, the production of very low income has not happened. And so the question is, do we want to structure an IHO that kind of caters to that income group? What Mayor Harvey said in the ad hoc was that he also wanted to extend the bandwidth to go to the 140% AMI to catch the missing middle. And I just want to make a quick comment about not necessarily that, but how important is it to our community to get to the VLI? How much importance is it to get to the missing middle? And I've been hearing that it's very important. And so we could play with the numbers, and it doesn't have to be 20%. It could be 25. It could be 30. The point is, at what point in our evolution do we want to get to the point where we can produce units. I love the fact that Sonoma's had a 20% number. Not a lot of jurisdiction in our county. Well, actually, we're the only jurisdiction in Sonoma County that has 20%. All the others have 10s and 15s. And one thing that I do want to point out, and that is that HCD, when they certify the housing element, which it's their job to do, and they're not obligated to do it. If we have a policy that's way out of whack, they're not obligated to certify our element. They'll point to state law and tell us why and the like. But the important thing is once they do certify our housing element, there's a presumption of validity that it meets state law in case of lawsuits that will come our way. And so I wanted to kind of put that out there to say that there's a threshold there that we want to make. That's all I had, Christina. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm just going to read the purpose, which has not been proposed to be changed. So this chapter delineates city requirements pertaining to inclusionary affordable units. In addition, as required by state law, this chapter offers incentives to developers for providing housing that is affordable to the types of household and qualifying residents identified in Sonoma Municipal Code 1944-025, eligibility for bonus and incentives. The incentive includes the ability to construct more residential dwelling units than normally allowed by the applicable general plan designation and zoning district, and other incentives and concessions provided by this chapter. In offering these incentives and concessions, this chapter is intended to implement the requirements of state law. So there's really two really important parts to this overall chapter. One is the inclusionary housing requirements, and then one is the density bonus provisions, which are dictated by state law. We did review our density bonus language, and it appears to be in alignment with current state law. We will be collaborating very closely with our city attorney to ensure that. The discussion tonight is really focusing on the inclusionary housing and not on the density bonus. That will be a topic for another day, but our first pass is that there are not major modifications that need to be made to it. As I mentioned, the density bonus law it's set by the state, and it changes fairly frequently. There are 2021 modifications, 2019 modifications, and the way our code is written right now, it's really pointing to state law, which saves us the effort of having to update our code every couple of years when it changes. And as I in the beginning mentioned, our code has not been comprehensively updated since 2006. It does take a lot of time and energy to make these changes. So having that section rely on state law right now is feeling like a lower priority to make modifications than the inclusionary housing portion. So here's our existing inclusionary housing. It's pretty short. We have a different but extremely similar standards for the residential Sonoma zoning district, as well as in other residential zoning districts. There has been some confusion with our existing code about mixed use zoning. And that's one of the benefits by having one standard, that for all residential projects, they would have the same standard. So under residential Sonoma, a development containing 5 or more parcels or units shall provide that at least 20% of the total parcels or units are affordable to households in the low and moderate income categories, and at least 1/2 of the affordable parcels or units of any residential development containing 10 or more shall be affordable to the low income category. So the low and moderate is a little ambiguous, and historically the city has let the developers choose whether they wanted to do low or moderate, and we're looking to fix that. So the proposed amendments are to strike all of that language that was just on the screen and replace it with some initial language about applicability, which clarifies that it's to residential development as well as residential components of a mixed use development. There are also exceptions for smaller homes, 850 square feet or less, clarifying that ADUs are not subject to this provision. that if existing residences are altered, improved, restored, that there are exceptions for that as well. And so here's the new language. It states a development containing 5 or more parcels or units shall provide the following affordable housing units. So this is new. There's 2 different standards for rental versus ownership. A rental project shall provide that at least 15% of the total parcels and or units are rental units that are affordable to households in the very low and low income categories, and 50% of the required number of affordable units for rent to households earning not more than low income household categories, and 50% of the dwelling units for rent to households earning not more than very low income household category. The first required unit shall be provided at the very low income household category. So the intent here is, you're going to end up having a lot of fractions. And so the first unit would be a very low, and then the second one would be low. And then under ownership, it says an ownership project shall provide that at least 25% of the total parcel and units are ownership units that are affordable to households in the very low, low, and moderate income categories, and 10% of the required number of affordable units for sale to households earning no more than moderate income category, 10 for low income, and 5 for very low. And these are the Director Storer made some recommended modifications to these numbers based on comments from Mayor Harvey. I'm just going to present what the language that went out to the public and is in the packet tonight. The first required unit shall be at the moderate income category, and the following unit shall be low, followed by very low. So the requirements for the rental project, instead of being 20%, has gone down to 15. The first required unit would be very low, followed by low. For ownership, it went from 20 to 25, and the first unit would be moderate and then working its way down. Are there any questions on this before I go on? Commissioner Bohar?
It may have been mentioned before, but who are the members of the ad hoc committee, please?
So it is Mayor Harvey and Councilmember Barnett, Planning Commission Chair Willander, Vice Chair Larry Barnett, and Commissioner Bob Felder.
Okay, thank you.
So another new addition is item 2 under C. A development containing 4 or fewer parcels or units shall pay a fee pursuant to 1944-030. So this is new in that previously we were only imposing inclusionary housing requirements on developments of 5 or more. And then D, fractional units. When the application of the percentages specified above results in a number that includes a fraction, the fraction shall be rounded up to the next whole number if the fraction is 0.5 or more. If the result includes a fraction below 0.5, the developer shall have the option of rounding up to the next whole number and providing the affordable unit on site, or paying an in lieu fee instead of providing an additional affordable unit. E addresses replacement units. If a proposed residential project would result in the elimination of existing deed restricted affordable housing units, the affordable dwelling units must be replaced on a 1-for-1 basis with equal affordability restrictions. We have a new proposed section F, inclusionary unit development standards. And the intent behind this section is to ensure that there is consistency between affordable units and the market rate units. There is an understanding that there may be a need for the affordable units to be somewhat smaller. With SB 330, we're attempting to be as specific and objective as possible so that the intent and requirements of this are as clear as possible for everyone. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's pretty long, but there are requirements about the timing of construction, that the affordable units, you can't spend 10 years building a development and then do the affordable units at the end, that they need to be integrated into the overall project and not clustered in one location. The average floor area of each unit shall be at least 75% of the average floor area for rental units, and the same number of bedrooms. That if there is a mix of units and sizes, that those reflect the overall development. That the exterior appearance be the same as the market rate units. And that they have access to open space and amenities. ADUs shall not be counted towards meeting a project's inclusionary housing requirements. ADUs are not necessarily deed restricted. And then clarification that whether or not they are for sale or for rental need to be stated at the beginning of a project. And the conditions of approval are required to clearly reflect that. The new section 1944-030 states that an in lieu fee may be paid instead of providing affordable units in a residential project of 4 units or fewer. Additionally, as provided in section 1944-020D, if the number of affordable units results in a fraction, an in lieu fee may be paid instead of providing an affordable unit. In lieu fees shall be paid prior to issuance of building permits for the project. In lieu fee shall be paid into the city's housing trust fund, earmarked for advancement and development of very low, and moderate income housing. City Council shall, from time to time, adopt a resolution setting forth the amount of the fees. As I mentioned earlier, we're not proposing any changes to the density bonus. And there is one more minor change, which is to 1944-060, continued availability. Currently, the term in the ordinance is for 55 years, and the ad hoc supported changing that to in perpetuity. And some additional clarifying language about forms and what type of inclusionary unit it should be. So if it's a rental project, it should be a rental inclusionary. An ownership project should have ownership units. I just have some suggestions for our discussion tonight to discuss the breakdown of rental versus ownership and the proposed percentages, the development standards section, the requirement for in lieu fees, modifying the terms from 55 years to in perpetuity, any other suggestions or comments to improve clarity in the section, and then anything else that the commission feels is important. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Speechless.
So good.
I do have a question. With the ad hoc committee's work, what have you been able to do in terms of getting feedback from builders in the area?
So this meeting is the first time that we've been sharing the information with the public. The packet went out last Friday, and this is the beginning of that process.
Okay, so that hasn't happened yet, but the plan is for it to get incorporated.
Correct.
Okay, soft cookie.
Soft cookie.
Okay.
Jim.
I support Commissioner O'Neill's comment as far as it being exposed to the developer and builder audience out there. Christina, can you tell me what kind of distribution you had on that? How is that selected?
So we are not like self-selecting or targeting specific individuals. You know, we have a lot of special interest groups. There's a lot of members of the public. So we're not saying that you know, the builder is more important than affordable housing advocates. We're including everybody equally through the staff report, the draft ordinance, and the process tonight.
Okay, does it appear that that's going to reach the building and development community? I didn't quite catch what you said about the activist groups. Are they being?
So we're not specifically advertising or targeting any individual group. We are reaching out to the public as a whole.
Okay.
So comment, and I would like clarity either from council or from David. If any of the commissioners wishes to reach out to a specific builder or public person, just expressing an opportunity for them to comment, Is that legal and appropriate?
Yes, by all means, Mr. Chair. The more people we can have interested in this, the better.
So I
No
would,
Brown Act violation with a one-to-one contact. You're okay.
Yeah, we did discuss this at the ad hoc, and the direction of the ad hoc was to not have focus groups or things like that, and to use the Planning Commission as the clearinghouse for all members of the public to review and comment.
And Mr. Chair, could we have David explain a little bit about the Brown Act on that? That'd be very
yes,
helpful. Because I think this won't be the first time you want to engage with the public, especially with our COVID world now, and then also breaking up.
please
Yeah,
go
as
ahead.
as appointed officials, public officials, your job is to engage with the community, get their feedback on the items that are going to be coming before the commission. What the Brown Act regulates is when a majority of you actually discuss business of the city. And so the Brown Act does not apply to individual contacts you have with constituents, with residents, with interested parties. It would only apply to discussions amongst, 3 or more commissioners, and it would prohibit that unless we are in a noticed public meeting like we are this evening.
Bob?
Yes, but David, isn't there the danger of a bias if, depending on the conversation you have with the general public, you have to be careful to solicit opinions from them without giving direction as to how you would proceed. Isn't that correct?
That is correct when the Planning Commission is sitting as a fact-finding body, for example, when it's granting a variance or a use permit. So when it's applying the city's municipal code to a particular application. What we are doing now is preparing a recommendation to the city council regarding legislation. So the Planning Commission in this instance is sitting in its quasi-legislative capacity. And in that capacity, you are probably expected to have a position on the different issues that are coming before the commission, and you have a right and potentially even an obligation to express those to others. But the point that you want to avoid is using your contacts with a developer or a constituent to learn about what the thinking of another planning commissioner might be on this ordinance, because that can lead to a serial meeting, which is a hub and spoke or a daisy chain type of a meeting. But the bias issue that you raised, a very important one for due process purposes, applies when you're dealing with an application, not when you're dealing with legislation.
Thank you.
So I would like to challenge my fellow commissioners that in an effort to achieve our goal of getting input from a wide variety of people, I would suggest that we all, if you feel appropriate and comfortable, invite someone to participate. I'm not suggesting you have to engage into a lengthy conversation with them, but again, if it was stated that we'd like to get some input from some builders, I would say, because this is invariably going to take more than just this evening, I would say let's be proactive. Jim?
Along those lines, yesterday I contacted one of the leading architects in town, asked him if he was aware of the meeting and the content of it, and he said, no, I haven't heard of it at all. Got a couple clients I need to call on that, and I directed him to the city website where all the information was. So I think the commission needs to be pretty darn proactive on this thing. I think these people are very important. Thank you.
Well, thank you. The notification process has not changed, and it's been, to my best of my knowledge, been in place for quite some time. So if someone's not aware of it, it's not that we aren't notifying it. But your point is taken, Jim. If you wish to express an invitation, by all means do it. But correct me if I'm wrong, either D5 or D4, that we are fulfilling our legal obligation of notification by the paper. Is that correct?
Yeah, and as we as D5 said, when you have a project, there's that added notification to people within a certain square footage, that's the distance, excuse me, square footage, distance from the property 500 feet. You'll get that, but in the case of a quasi-judicial act, or excuse me, legislative act, it's only in the newspaper, and it appears twice.
Okay, okay. So the challenge has been put forth. Do we have any more questions for Christina?
Just on the housing outreach, I just want to mention that for the housing element, part of the contract is going to be extensive community outreach. There's going to be study sessions and surveys and lots of that information going to all corners of the city and the valley as well. The changes before the Planning Commission tonight are relatively small by comparison. So we're going from, 20% across the board to dropping one down to 15, one up to 25, but overall they are still equaling 20%. Having input from our housing advocates, from our urban growth boundary advocates, from our developer communities is most welcome and will make it a better process for sure.
Larry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got some general comments and I guess I could call them questions, but I'm not going to put the planning staff on the spot tonight. I think it's something that's going to require some additional research. As part of the ad hoc, our discussions, clearly were done in a relatively fast manner. We spent a couple of hours on this topic, and there wasn't a lot of time to explore the deeper issues or the intent of the city in the long term. And frankly, my understanding is that we've kind of jumped ahead on this inclusionary requirement discussion because, as we all know, there are a limited number of significant parcels within city limits to be developed, and there is a bit of a land rush on the part of developers and housing developers who are securing options on these properties and wanting to move ahead on applications. Some of the properties require annexation, but other properties that are in question or within the city limits require no annexation. And as I understand the rules, an application that's submitted to the city and deemed complete by the city will essentially fall under the terms of our current inclusionary requirement unless it's changed. So the intent, in part, of addressing this inclusionary requirement, which I think typically would have been part of the housing element review, is to be able to get ahead of this issue of this development push in the city so that we can maximize the advantage for inclusionary housing and tweak our 20% one-size-fits-all approach that's only yielded moderate priced affordable housing and try to push these development projects into a greater diversity of pricing and levels of affordability. And so, but we are going to have a chance to revisit this topic once the housing element process is completed, and we can tweak the numbers that we're talking about here tonight, depending on what it is we settle on, either tonight or at the end of this process. And that can be, and I would expect would be, a part of the development process for the housing element. But in the meantime, the issue before us, as I see it, is how best to manage a situation where there are a limited number of parcels available, and if we don't make a change relatively quickly, they're going to be developed at 20% and moderate level income. So as to the percentages, I think that, one could ask the question, how did we come up with 20% in the first place? The fact is that my memory is that the 20% was pretty much pulled out of the air. Sonoma is kind of at the top of many of the cities in Sonoma County at 20%. So we've already taken a fairly assertive step in the past that way. The issue is this low income and moderate has resulted essentially in only moderate. As to the percentages that are being included, I can't give any great logic as to why it's 15% or 25% any more than I can give you logic as to why it was 20%. The fact is, we don't have the kind of, at least as I understand it, analysis of data to determine what is an optimum percentage in any given community for their affordable housing inclusionary requirement. Along those lines, the kind of information I think would be helpful to me and to us going forward would be the following. I would like to know, because we've been doing affordable housing now here in Sonoma for many years, and much of it done under the redevelopment agency aegis when it existed. And when I first got involved in this 30 years ago, the term of affordability was 35 years. And then it's moved to 55 years, and now we're talking about making it in perpetuity. A question I've got is how many units that are currently designated as affordable are going to be expiring over the next decade? There are some that are clearly going to reach that 35-year threshold. And I'd like to know how many of those there are, because in a sense, we have to deduct them from the pool of affordable housing, because once they fall out of that category, they're going to then become market rate units. I would be interested in knowing precisely the number of inclusionary units created during the past 2 decades. We know that during the last 10 years, at least when we had that Housing Our Community Forum, the discussion was that we had an average of 27 housing units built each year during the last decade. I guess that was information from a couple of years ago. Obviously, at 20%, even if all 27 of those units had been subject to the inclusionary requirement, which they were not, because single-family homes, a single individual home, is not subject to it at all. The most that we've been producing is 5 inclusionary units a year on average over the last decade. And I would expect that the average is somewhat higher, perhaps in the previous years, not talking about affordable housing units as a total, because when the city was doing the redevelopment agency, we were doing large projects. I'm just talking about determining how many inclusionary units we've actually produced in the past 2 decades. I would be interested in what the current rental levels are and the sales prices, if they are sold, of the regulated affordable housing units that are out there today. In other words, looking at on a for sale unit, the limitation is one of appreciation. I can't remember exactly what the calculation is in terms of a percentage of appreciation. And therefore, I can't calculate what a unit bought 10 years ago for X price is now saleable today. But I would be interested in that number, because I want to get a sense of what the actual numbers are that we're talking about when we talk about affordability. The final question I've got that's going to take some work would be looking at some projects that have taken place over the past few years and actually coming up with a dollar price calculation for the asking price of the affordable units in the projects that have been done. I know that they're tied to the AMI and the moderate level, but I don't know what the actual sales price has actually turned out to be, whether it's been at the 80% side of the moderate or the 120% side of the moderate. There's a pretty big swing there. And I'd like to get a dollar amount. Just once again, maybe this is a function of age for me, But, you know, when I think in terms of $500,000 or $600,000, that sounds like an enormous amount of money to me. But you know, I'm an old guy, so $500,000 or $600,000 still impresses me as a number, but I don't know if it's a particularly high number relative to incomes today. So I'd like to actually see what the dollar amounts are for things, so I can get a sense, if for my own purposes, a sense of perspective as to what the market prices of things actually are and what affordable units actually appear to be in terms of price thresholds. So those are some of the research things I'd like to gather. I mean, I'd like to feel that we're going to make a decision that's a knowledge-based approach to our decision making, which includes the data, as opposed to just seat of the pants, that feels good to me approach, which, you know, may be a perfectly valid thing to do. And as I say, we're talking about a relatively small number of units that have been and probably will be produced because of inclusionary requirements. The last thing I'm going to ask is this. If in fact we're attempting to get the most affordable units we possibly could as quickly as possible, why not set the inclusionary requirement even higher? Why not talk about 30%? When I argue this with myself, the argument is, well, Larry, if you set it at 30%, you're going to essentially disincentivize market rate developers to build anything. But I'm prepared to sacrifice market rate development for a while to find out whether or not, in fact, you could get 30%. And when the housing element process is completed, we can always decide, well, that 30%, which we've had in place for a year or so, certainly hasn't worked as we had hoped. So we have the opportunity to drop it down. But I'm figuring here there might be an opportunity to actually be aggressive about it. I understand from David Storer that HCD frowns upon anything above 15%. They want you to justify it's not going to have an unduly negative impact on your production of affordable housing. On the other hand, the state moves slowly. Let's assume Sonoma put a 30% or even more figure on the affordable housing inclusionary requirement. By the time the state got around to questioning it, which would be through the submission of our housing element for certification, probably, unless a home developer made a complaint to the state about the level of our inclusionary requirement, by the time that complaint works through the system, we will have had an opportunity to evaluate whether 30% worked or didn't work. Maybe it would work. I mean, this is kind of the seat of the pants from the gut approach. It's not data-based because we don't have any data, and frankly, I don't think there is any out there. But I do think there's an opportunity here to be potentially more aggressive and see what the effect is. Thank you.
Mr.
Thank
Chair,
you, Larry. Before,
Mr. Chair, if I can add to
Yeah.
Larry's comment, just a minor technical change there. HCD does in fact take a dim view, as Larry said. The 15% relates to any of the income categories, any of the four that I mentioned. So for example, Sonoma has a 20% requirement, and because we have the 210 approach, you know, the 210s, you can go one or the other. The point being is, it's if we had a 20% requirement and we had 5% VLI and 20% pick a category, that's when they get upset. Not the fact that we broached in total 15%. So yeah. So I mean, it's worse than what Larry said in a way, because they want to make sure that we haven't unduly constrained, restricted development. So if we wanted to say let's have 20% VLI, 20% LI, and 20% moderate, they'll go nuts over those three categories because each one of them's over 50% each. They won't care about the 60%. They'll care about, obviously they will in a way, but I hope you can get the gist of what I'm saying here. So I'd be concerned about going over 15% in any one category, but all we have to do is justify that it's not unduly restraining development. And how we do that, I don't know.
I would just comment. I don't
I'm
think
sorry,
that
go ahead.
the intent was to make major changes in a really quick way. What our goal was, this was identified as a priority starting in August. We have worked our way through most of the short-term changes and are working our way through the mid changes. And our goal right now is to make some minor tweaks. So going from 20 to 15 and then 20 to 25, we're looking at minor tweaks to try to and improve clarity, try to get some very low income units and to comply with SB 330.
Very
Chair
good.
Wellender?
1 second, before we continue, I know that this is not a project type. I would like all of us to have an opportunity to speak, but I know at some point there may be some public out there that would like also to speak. Is it, this would be to D5, would it be a D4? Is this appropriate to have our total commission discussion and then open it up to the public, or would it be prudent to open it up for the public first before we complete everybody's comments?
And I would certainly like to open it to the public first because there's some good speakers there waiting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's at the discretion of the chair, but generally this would be the best time to take questions for staff, then open it to the public, then close that public comment and have the in-depth
Very
discussion with the
So to that extent, we'll be consistent. So I know typically we say, do you have any questions for staff? We can go ahead and have further discussion, but let's do that after we open it up to the public. So does anybody have specific questions for staff? Yes, Jim.
I think this is appropriate. Based on what Commissioner Barnett said, we probably do have some data in the past to find out what the impact of our existing regulations are, say 5 or 10 years out. I thought I heard that we had 117 units between 2015, 2019. Is that fair to say, Christina?
Yeah, and I can share my screen. So I think the data that we have in front of us is just looking at our arena numbers and what we've been able to produce in the city. So overall, as far as arena goes, we're in really good shape. The city has been meeting and exceeding our goals. So our as far as HCD goes and this current housing cycle, we've done a really good job of producing the required housing. The next cycle is going to be much more challenging. We know that. And so what we're looking at right now is trying to make some tweaks to address the holes that we're seeing right now. So the holes are that we have very few, very low and low income units. And part of that is it's really just because of the way our ordinance is written. It says low and moderate. We have no requirements for very low, and there is nothing that is requiring developers to even provide the low income units.
But this is affordable housing overall. This is not just inclusionary housing.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Right.
This is building in total.
So this is all of the housing units that have been produced in the city of Sonoma starting in 2015. So very low, low, and moderate are looking at what is deed restricted. Moderate's actually split into two different, all of them are split into two categories, if they're deed restricted or not. If it's deed restricted, it's either part of a density bonus like the Alta Madrona project, or it's part of the inclusionary housing ordinance. So for example, on Mockingbird Lane, Oliva, all of those projects where there were 5 or more units, we have it's an inclusionary unit. We have deed restrictions on those and legal paperwork with the city requiring that those stay as affordable housing units. For the moderate category, we have deed restricted and non-deed restricted. So a non-deed restricted moderate unit would be like an ADU.
I understand, but you can't break out from this list what are the inclusionary units that have been produced. Am I right?
Well, the very low, low, and moderate in this table are inclusionary units.
So we could get that data in the last 5 years at least. Is that accurate, Christina? We could get.
So that's what's on the screen. So this is the units. So the total units is 59 units. 49 of those are above moderate. 4 are moderate, 2 are low, and 4 are very low.
Okay, so based on that, it would be certainly useful, but it sounds moot whether we could get a projection of the impact of the proposed regulations. Do you foresee that as possible, to get a projection about what we're going to, what we can contrast the old regulation implications and the new ones.
So I based on what I'm seeing and interpreting is that we, based on our current regulations, that we are meeting our RENA goals, and our baseline right now is 20%. So we are making one tweak up and one tweak down. The overall goal is hopefully that they're balancing each other out and not making overall huge impacts on the provision of housing. We do know we've had very important conversations over the years that there is a break-even point, and that at some point it's not worth it to a developer to do the project. And that's why HCD has the requirements for not going over a certain percentage. If we say, 50% affordable housing, well, none's going to get made. So it's a balancing act. You want it to be high enough and of the right categories that we get as much housing units as possible. But you only get those units if the developers can come in and build the projects.
And then,
So-
and personally, if I can, Mr. Chair, to add to what Christina just said, if you look in that far left column under the very low, I'll read it as 24, and you'll see that the Altamira project is 100% affordable, and most of it, if you look down at the very bottom there, it shows out of the 48 units or so, 38 are very low, 5 are low, and 4 are moderate, and 1 above moderate, and that's for the caretaker.
But none of those are inclusionary units. This is all under the affordable housing category.
Right.
What we're talking about tonight, which is the inclusionary category, we don't have those numbers specifically broken out anywhere.
But the Altamira is deed restricted, so we do actually have that, but they're not deed restricted through us, it's through the CDC. And the other point too that I can tell you is we actually do have a list of all of the units we've put into contract under the Affordable Housing Ordinance, and we'll provide that at our next meeting. We have it for all of the units, and we can provide those totals for you, going back from the very first date back to when some of those start to expire.
Terrific.
Okay, I'm going to change my tune. Let's open it up to the public. Then we'll come back. Everybody will have a chance to ask more questions, so let's open it up to the public.
Looks like Bill Willers has had his hand up for quite some time. I'm going to
Okay.
allow Bill to speak.
Welcome, Bill. You're muted, Bill.
Here we go. Good evening, Chair Wellender and rest of the commissioners. I enjoyed reading the changes to the inclusionary, the work that the ad hoc did to the inclusionary ordinance. I think it's a good move that it's actually being raised in the market rate to 25%. I think at the 15% in the rental market, you'll probably incentivize more rental projects because of the lower inclusionary requirement, which I think is in itself producing more forms of affordable housing. So I hope it works that way. I would support actually raising the market rate inclusionary beyond 25%, or incentivizing the production of low and very low income by reducing the inclusionary amount if the developer agrees to produce only those types of inclusionary units. So they may get some relief from a much higher number, but the city benefits from getting the kind of affordable housing produced by the developer that it wants. And that is, we've overproduced moderate income housing. We all know that. We haven't produced very low and low income housing via inclusionary units. We've only produced it via capital A affordable housing project. And so maybe a way to provide a carrot for a developer and benefit the city is to offer some relief from a higher percentage of inclusionary housing if they produce only low and very low as their inclusionary housing component. So if it was 30, you could provide 20 if that 20 was only low and very low. That cost impact in terms of low and very low on market rate is substantial. But if they're looking at a 30% requirement across the board, including moderate, it may still pencil out and thereby benefit the city. One of the concerns about this, though, is that we don't really have the data from our soon-to-be revised housing element, and I think that's critical information for the Planning Commission to be making a decision about inclusionary housing. And I know that there are time constraints presented by SB 330 and the movement of applications that's into the city for housing projects and the desire to get ahead of them. But I do think that the housing element will more clearly define what the needs are of the city. And I think that those things are going to be, how are we going to produce more low and very low income housing in the future, including the inclusionary side of it. And then lastly, I think that in our moving forward, as we're discussing housing in the community, I really think that we need to relate density to affordability. I think that we have higher density zone properties in the community with the intent of producing affordable housing, but they haven't done that. What they've produced is market rate housing at high density. And I think in the future, the Planning Commission really needs to consider a way of tying the highest density to the highest affordability and reducing density for the lowest affordability, even in those properties that offer the highest density. And I look forward to working with the Commission around that idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
So Fred Ellenbach would like to speak.
Mr. Chair, if I can, before while we tee up Fred, just if I could make a comment about Bill's comment. We just received information this week that some census data from ABAG is now available to us. I haven't even had the chance to tell Wendy this. She'll be working on our housing element. I'm not been able to talk to Christine because she's on vacation. And so my point is maybe at the next meeting or the meeting after, we would have time to at least synthesize and review that information and provide it to your commission. But we want to do it as you direct.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Let's invite Fred back.
Thank you. I'd like to point out that activists have been calling for these inclusionary changes for years. I'd like to ask the commissioners to please read my comments submitted tonight and glean ideas that I'm not able to say here in 3 minutes. I think the current proposal is good, and I'm encouraging you to approve it now. I agree 100% with Larry's reasoning on the timing. You can come back later and strengthen the inclusionary requirements where appropriate during the housing element process. If the city wants to justify higher numbers at a lower AMI for the inclusionary, I went to inclusionaryhousing.org. They recommend to do a housing needs analysis or residential housing nexus study to establish solid baseline of demographic data to justify stronger or higher percent inclusionary policy. The city's got 20 million in reserves. Spend the money on a study. That's not going to be, that's a drop in the bucket for 20 million. And if housing needs analysis is required to have a 20 or 25% inclusion and not freak out HCD too much, if it's weighted to lower AMI, then let's do one as soon as possible. I think it's clear that the city is already unduly constraining lower income housing. The city can further invest in a market rate developer feasibility study about what exactly the costs and profits are. There's also lots of data from local studies that's available. I'd suggest that making the city inclusion, I would suggest keeping it at 20 or bump it to 25% and still weight it to the lower AMI. And I don't understand what would be stopping that. I'd like to see what the state laws and thresholds are that is constraining that. I think that a case can be made that with Sonoma's persistent inflated real estate values, the 25 or 25% inclusionary requirement weighted to the lower AMI would be justified. Market rate developers make a relatively higher profit here. And from this higher profit margin, higher inclusions at a lower income level would be justified. especially given that there's a demonstrable high cost burden rate for a large percent of renters and service workers here. As far as unduly constraining development, the RENA performance stats from the last 20 years show that as we know, that the lower income units have been underproduced and market rate has been way overproduced. I'm curious if the city's nexus study that was done for, I believe, commercial projects might suffice for some of this inclusionary process. Also, I would suggest that inclusionary units be required in the new ordinance to accept Section 8 vouchers, require extremely low units in the inclusionary ordinance, and require market rate partnerships with non-profit developers to build units with deeper affordability so we can balance the missing middle category with extremely low and do some innovative projects that way with different types of developers. I recommend setting the in lieu fee for residential as equal or slightly higher than the actual cost to build a unit. Incentives for tax abatement, parking reductions.
Fred, I'll give you another 30 seconds, but the good news is we'll be talking about this the next time around, so this will not be your last time.
It's really difficult to strain hours and hours of work through 3 minutes. And I'm the chair of the CSEC, and I let people like myself talk for a while, so it's really frustrating to put this much time and wait hours and then not even be able to finish another paragraph.
Brad, I recognize that, but you also have been very good at providing written information, for which I do believe we take seriously and do read. So it was not intended to be an insult.
I understand. It's just, you know, let me just make one final comment here.
Sure.
I would like to see define. Let's see what state law. I'm sorry. I'm all flustered now, so I'll just end now. But I would say for the density bonus, copy the county density bonus. And thanks for listening to my comments.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I can just add to Fred's comments.
Please.
That he, I don't know if you caught it, but he zinged in another acronym in there, which is good. He talked about extremely low income. And you said, well, where did that one come from and what does it mean? Well, ELI is a subset of the VLI. And in Christina's chart, Christina, can you go back to that chart where you showed the city's RENA is like number 8 or 9 or something like that? I'd like to point that out if you can just share the screen, because it's a point not to be missed.
This one or the old one?
The old one, the one that's got the 137. Yeah, the one before this. There you go. If you can blow that up a little bit.
Yeah. Oops.
There you go. So if you look at the very top of the chart there of table, whatever it is, can't read it, my eyes aren't that good, table H, you'll see the extremely low and the very low. You can see the AMI numbers there. You add up those 12, and that's typically how it's done in most agencies. You'll take a 50-50 split of your VLI number and have 12 to the extremely, or 50% to the extremely low. In our case, it happens to be 12. So the 137 is really a composite of 24 VLI, of which 50% of that is extremely low, the 23 units of low, 27 of moderate. And as I mentioned at the outset, the above moderate is where Mayor Harvey was talking about providing a category for the 140%, which would be the missing middle. And again, anything that we produce in the missing middle would go towards that 63 number or that particular income household category. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Very good. Okay, anyone else from the public?
Yes, so Dave would like to speak. So Dave, I'm going to unmute you, and if you could state your name and address for the record, please.
looks muted. Oh, there you go.
There we go. The mouse wasn't working too well. So Dave Sickert, I live on 1163 Pierce. And first of all, I said it before, but you guys do an amazing job. I'm just always impressed by all the detail. And the efforts of the ad hoc committee are to be applauded. I think, we need to look at affordable housing for everyone in town. I'm going to mix it up a little bit. Looking at developing new homes makes a ton of sense. But for all of us that drive through town, and if you drive down Broadway or a lot of other streets in town, you'll notice there's a lot of signs out, space available. And it's commercial space. And in particular, down Broadway, it's commercial space that, when you look at it, at one point in time was obviously residential space. And any of the articles you read today in the paper, almost any paper, indicate that commercial space is probably not coming back for quite a while. People are, working remotely. So a lot of the space is going to continue to be empty. And in fact, a lot of space in town has been empty for a while. So I think one of the things I would encourage as we look at solutions is to expand what we're thinking a little bit further. And if we've got infrastructure in place that can be converted from its current use to another use, there's space available that could actually be delivered probably sooner than some of the things we're talking about here with developing new property. So, on one hand, I just make the case, we to kind of incentivize a little bit a carrot and stick approach. When we have abandoned property on one side of the street, we fine it and tow it. But if we have abandoned property on the other side of the sidewalk, it tends to stay abandoned and there's nothing that's done about it. So I think we can look at our code and maybe use a carrot and stick on some of the vacant commercial property and maybe create some new opportunities that we're not looking at today. Thank you, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, David.
There's no more comment from the public.
So before I pull it back, actually, I will pull it back to the commission, but something I want you to want to throw out and would like some feedback from in these study sessions or in these hearings that we're doing this evening. I think Fred's comment is valid and that invariably he does tremendous amount of work. Would there be any support if on these types of studies that we gave the public either a larger time frame of maybe 5 minutes and or the idea of if they have a lot to share to do it in 2 3-minute intervals but broken up? Any thoughts?
Yes, do that.
No. Sheila, what's your thought?
Absolutely. Especially during these Zoom calls, it might change once we get in person. But right now, the people that are attending and putting the effort in are truly dedicated, and there's not that many of them. So I think we could certainly expand the time.
Thank you. Larry?
Well, when I was on the city council for 12 years, we didn't have a 3-minute rule and we didn't have a 3-minute timer. And this was something that came to pass after I was off the council. I've never liked it. I think it makes no sense. If you have a public hearing and you've got 35 people who want to speak, of course you've got to limit it to a couple of minutes or 3 minutes. But in a meeting like this where you've got 5 people who want to speak, I think, setting a 3-minute time limit has lost its place. It frankly is counterproductive. It makes people feel under too much pressure, and it deprives the commission and frankly the council, which operates under the same rules, of the opportunity for a full-throated examination of a topic. I mean, I think it's the chair's prerogative always to say, listen, so-and-so, I need you to wrap up. You don't want someone to go on forever. But with only a few people lined up to speak, I think giving people 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, let them share with us the intelligence and brilliance of their ideas, and we're all better off for it. I definitely support giving people more time.
Anyone else?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I mean, obviously during COVID, I fully support what's been said here. With COVID, it's hard for us all to know how many people are in there waiting. When we went through Verizon, for example, we could all see the people that wanted to speak, and I think 3 minutes was appropriate in that occasion. So we know then that people wanted more, but there was a way around that. Let's go ahead and, like you said, Vice Chair, Chair's commission, the Chair's prerogative, let him make that decision. It'd be helpful if we knew ahead of time, so that we can kind of tone the time.
So what I'd like to do then is two things. So I'll take everyone's comments into consideration, and I've kind of set the tone, good, bad, or indifferent this evening, but I certainly will take your thoughts and considerations to heart, and we'll move forward next time. I would like to suggest we take a 10-minute break and be ready to come back, and I'm bringing the topic back to the full commission, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Yeah. No.
This doesn't go on. I'm ready to be complete.
Patry had her hand up before and then it was gone, but it's back up again. So I don't know if you're gonna need to reopen the public comment.
Well, I think she took the time to write, and I think would be remiss not to give her the opportunity. So I will, unless someone either D4 or D5 tells me that I'm being illegal, I'll go ahead and open it back up so that she has the opportunity to speak. Okay, we're down to 2 minutes. As soon as we come back online, I do before we go and open it back to the public. Commission, and I'm not sure if that's good or bad, so I'd love some feedback whether 10 minutes is too much or 5 minutes is not enough.
We'll find out when we see how promptly people come back.
I know. Eyes glaze over. But I think if we're supposed to be serious about listening,
after you've had your discussion, which I appreciate. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, do we see anybody else out in the public waving a hand?
Yes, Dennis Aftergut would like to speak.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be heard. Dennis Aftergut, 1315 5th Street East. I join in Johanna's comments. I appreciate what the commission has been saying. I appreciate many of the points that are made, especially Commissioner Barnett's statement that the change like this can have very important impact and should be database as much as possible. I'm just wondering in terms of process, whether the commission ever considers having a kind of, this is legislation, a kind of legislative hearing where it doesn't depend simply on who shows up by having gotten notice, but you invite developers to explain what the impact of the changes would be on them, on their ability to provide affordable housing, and their interest in working with these, their interest in obviously being at least market developers in profitability, in working with these regulations. I did ask a developer friend of mine what he thought. He looked at the proposal and thought, as Johanna said, that it quite favors rental projects and disfavors ownership projects, to the point that he being an ownership project developer probably wouldn't be interested in doing business. That could just be random, but I think it's important to know whether or not the incentives are such that developers, private developers at least, would be interested in developing housing of all kinds. I also didn't understand whether the object here was to say, developer, you have to choose between rental project or ownership project. I didn't understand whether that was the intent or whether they could be mixed. I think giving developers flexibility to fit the circumstances of a site, of a community, of the geography of the particular parcel, advances the purpose of adding housing. And I didn't understand the purpose for having different standards for different affordability requirements for rental projects at 50% and 25%. I didn't know whether that was what the intention was. I was curious about that. Last thing I want to say is that in addition to considering a hearing in which you invite developers, you might consider looking for and inviting economists who do work in this area. There have to be some, and they could give their point of view, their expert point of view, on what the incentives and disincentives are in the proposal. I thank you very much for allowing me to speak, and I appreciate your work in trying to advance the cause of affordable housing, both in rentals and affordable housing ownership opportunities, ownership being the foundation of the American dream, and it should not be restricted to people of wealth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anyone else?
No additional public comment.
Okay. Then let me close the public and bring it back to my fellow commissioners. And for clarity, I am not setting the 3-minute timer. So please, who would like to speak up?
I would like to make some comments.
Please.
Thank you. I want to echo some of the comments or suggestions that we really need to have more economic data to say, what have we done so far? What has the success been with what we've done? I think all of these programs are really well intentioned. I just don't know that they're succeeding. And as a mortgage banker, I work with people all the time that are trying to buy homes. I work with people that do qualify for the affordable. I also work with people that know how to manipulate systems really well. And I can see all of this happening. So my big concern is if we're not looking at data to see what has worked, what hasn't worked, I just feel like we could be giving these opportunities to savvy people and it won't achieve the desired goals and intentions that we have. I don't know if anybody saw the article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the number of pension funds and large publicly traded companies that are buying homes. And they're buying them because that's the best return on investment now, is to buy these homes in blocks. And that's a better investment than, you know, putting your money in the bank or investing in the stock market. So anything that we do, anything that we set up, I think it needs to, like what Johanna Patry said and Dennis was saying, is if we can reward of ownership, individual ownership, that would be the highest priority. And I don't see anything here that I would like to see something related to down payment assistance programs, which I think could also be an effective tool in helping people qualify to purchase homes in our community. So I'm just feeling like this is all well intentioned, but I just don't see enough data here to say that we're on the right path or what we need to tweak. And that's what I'll be looking for. Thanks.
Thank you, Sheila.
Lander, could I jump in for a moment?
Sure.
This is just tying into a lot of those comments. So part of the housing element process is going to be that housing needs assessment. It's part of the RFP. It's a required part of a housing analysis. The housing element's going to take place over the next several years. So that data will be coming along. So I do hear a lot of concerns about making some of the proposed changes, and potentially an alternative would be to keep it at the 20% and just do some cleanups. It had been the desire of the ad hoc to go this direction with making the recommended changes, but there are other alternatives to doing nothing.
Thanks, Christina.
All right, anyone else would like to speak? Please. Bob? Go ahead. Unmute, please. You're muted.
Now I'm not muted. Going back to what Larry said way back in the beginning, there's a lot of research that needs to be done, but we're in a kind of a developer's housing rush to fill up vacant properties. And so I think we ought to not overthink this thing at this point, but to get some clarifications in place and to get some incentives in place to produce some of the lower income properties, whether they be rental or ownership, out there to see if it works, rather than just, you know, we could talk about this for months and come up with yet another reason to delay it. But I think we got to move fast.
Thank you, Bob. I see no other hands. Question for, I'll say D4 and D5. Does anything preclude us to make these?
We don't have a D4 here, Ron. We only have a D2 and a D5.
Well, no, I've demoted him to D4.
Oh.
Because I know. D2 and D5, excuse me, it's late for me. Along Bob's lines, can we make some thoughtful changes now? And then as the housing need analysis evolves during the future months under the housing element, is there any reason why we can't come back, change something and make the recommendation to city council to, you know, change it?
Absolutely not. You can change anywhere, anything in the development code you want, whenever you want. remember that you're in an advisory capacity at this point and make
Right.
a recommendation to the council. So, yeah,
Right.
you could do nothing as well. You could recommend the council don't touch it.
So back to Bob's comment though, in essence, knowing that we have a certain amount of pressure with prospective projects or projects that are in the pipeline or coming our way, it does seem to be prudent that if there is an opportunity to improve our ability to make affordable housing units, at least from my limited perspective this evening, it seems like there would be value in not sitting on waiting for a lot more data. Not to say we shouldn't request the data, but that we should give strong consideration to moving forward with a recommendation to City Council of some sorts.
Yeah, I'd really like to come back to you after we've had a chance to look at the census data. I mean, it may not amount to anything, but we just found out there is data, and maybe economic, I don't know, and that may help inform. The purpose of the data coming from the census through ABAG to the counties and cities is to help us in the preparation of our housing element. So in one way, we've got this greater analysis that's going to come through the housing element, but for now, we've been asked and tasked to look at the IHO to see if there are some changes that we want to make in the short term. So yes, we can get that data next. We can also provide you again with all of the units that we've built in Sonoma. I believe we're getting close to 200 total units, and they all have varying times of expiration. We'd like to provide that to you for you to review as well.
So this may indeed be now a question for D5, but I'll backtrack. It's confusing to me why in the past we've given the developers the choice whether they build very low, whatever. Can we just simply dictate what type of inclusionary housing that their project is going to have to produce, rather than giving them a choice, seeing how things have been tilted so much to the moderate?
That's what we're trying to do with the current language, so in taking out the and the ambiguous language and specifying which percentages need to be provided at which income level.
And remember, as we said at the outset, you're not obligated. Not every city in California has an IHO. About 30% of them do. And again, that's another issue for another day. D5, anything?
No, I think that sums it up. I mean, the limits are going to be on the total percentage of the project that's required to be inclusionary housing. Okay. And those are going to be limited by, the Constitution and the Takings Clause, as well as, any requirement that HCD may have to review with respect to rental housing.
Very good. And this may be too simplistic of thinking, but is it legal, possible to, if a project comes before us that is the market rate units are for sale, that it be required that any inclusionary units be for sale and not rent? And conversely, if a project comes before us and is presented as rental complex, that then the inclusionary units for that project that be also just be rental? Could it be as simple as that?
Christine, you want to take that?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Oh, she's on vacation. Go back to my question is, if a project comes before us that the predominant portion of the project that's market rate is for ownership, could we not then require the inclusionary percentage to be ownership? And conversely, if a project comes before us and the project narrative is that it's rentals, that then the inclusionary elements or the inclusionary requirement would therefore have to be rental.
So that's in the current draft, is to pair them up with what's being proposed. Dennis Aftergut made a good comment that maybe there's some projects that want to be mixed. So we might need to take a closer look at that. I believe the languages can just be tweaked by saying something about the percentages, but I believe that language is in the draft right now.
Yeah, and I think the only legal limitation is that a developer of ownership properties has to have the opportunity of instead providing rental properties.
That's by law. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a statute on that point. They have to have that option.
And that was driven by what?
D5, are you talking about the Palmer fix under AB 15?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Chair Willander, we talked about this briefly in the ad hoc. There was a point in time when rentals were verboten, and in the sense of requiring them only. And there was a law that was changed to allow now for rentals to be able to fee out, such that you don't have to have rentals with just being built, because they couldn't build them in some cases. And so the development community now has the option to be able to fee out for rentals. D5, if you want to add to that.
That's right. And I think this is actually something that's going to be dealt with in the housing element. So it's not something that has to be put into the inclusionary housing ordinance.
Okay, thank you. Larry?
Well, I just want to say I think that I understand, or I support the intent of redirecting the inclusionary units to be more inclusive of low and very low income. And that's what the current draft language includes. And because of the preponderance of market rate inclusionary units over the last decade, we're out of balance. And I think this is now an attempt going forward to rebalance that mix so we end up with more at the lower end. And I support that. I think it's where the greatest deficit is, whether it's ownership or rental. And I actually support both. But I think tilting it so that it does provide the purpose of building more at the lower end is a positive step. I consider it, a rebalancing effort on our part. And so I'd like to see it move ahead in that spirit. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Larry. Bob?
And I agree with Larry on that. I think I'd like to see this move ahead quickly. And I'm not, yes, maybe there's some data that you could provide to us, D2, at the next meeting that might clarify some of these issues to some degree. But I think that the intent is to try to rebalance, and I'd like to get this in front of the council as quickly as we can. This is still only a recommendation.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I can probably do something that I shouldn't be doing, but that's why we have an attorney with us. You're going to speak a little bit tonight after this item to talk about when we meet next.
Correct.
Without getting into the weeds and violating something that I'm sure I'm going to violate here, can we provide you with the data on our existing housing stock, which is the affordable housing stock that we have, and the times and dates of expiration at a meeting before your May meeting?
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And I will, I guess as soon as we wrap this up, we can discuss about our next meeting. So would anybody else like to share any other comments? So let me throw something out there. I believe that we've made progress, that there has been some good discussion. I would like a little bit more opportunity to digest some of the comments that came from the public. So I would be supportive of the idea of reconvening with a continuation of this to a special meeting on April 22nd, which will be in 2 weeks. And there will be another agenda item that I'll talk about later. And that was the impetus behind needing a second meeting in April. But I like it because it allows us to digest a little bit for those that have not participated as the ad hoc, that it gives us a little bit more time to think about comments that may or may not have been shared, or all the written comments. But I think I would like to then state in the spirit of both Bob and Larry, that we then target that by the evening, at the end of the evening of the 22nd, we have a recommendation to forward on to City Council to move on. Bob?
I have one question on that. If we were to hold a meeting on the 22nd and decide to move forward at that point, is there enough time to get it to the council for a May meeting?
I will need,
You would need the time to do noticing.
yeah, we'll need time to do the staff report noticing. I've got 10 days to advertise it in the paper before we can hit the hearing. It may be tough. to get-
But they have two
readings
I
before the council. So the first reading is usually doesn't require the noticing, but the second reading would. So that would be 2 weeks after the first.
So
Perfect,
hang on a second. We're talking about the council meeting for their first introduction. And what was asked was, do we have the ability to get to the council for the 19th? I'm going to say probably no. The 19th will be too much of a dance for us to do, looking at the other things that we have on the agenda for that meeting for the city council. But I feel comfortable getting it to them on the May 3rd meeting.
Yeah, but if we don't recommend till the 22nd, can we get it to them on the 3rd?
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, probably the 17th. And at that date, by the way, the council will be discussing a series of other housing issues that they discussed in their quarterly meeting this past week. So I think we could wrap that up on the 17th and do the introduction there. As D5 was saying, we would then do the introduction at the meeting in June.
That'd be the second reading in June, the first reading on the 17th?
Yeah, what we're doing now is we're terming them introduction, which is the old terminology for first reading, and then
Okay.
adoption, and that's according with our legal counsel, Jeff.
So in the spirit of moving so-called ball down the field, is that doable? I mean, is that favorable to you fellow commissioners?
Well, I will move to continue the item to a special meeting of April, what did you say, 22nd?
Correct.
Yeah, that's assuming we can establish a quorum. Can we go ahead and just do that right now, Ron?
Yeah, let's just do a quick, who might be available for the 22nd?
We need 4.
I'm available, but I get my second vaccine that morning, so hopefully I'll be feeling okay.
You will be.
All right.
No sweat.
We got 4, and Commissioner Bohar's still checking. So let's run with it. Maybe we'll have Commissioner Bose and McDonald available as well. So we'll shoot.
So in the meantime, I just want to reiterate that the challenge was given. If there are people in the community that you believe could add to this discussion, by all means, invite them. And then we'll target to actually, at the end of our meeting, have something definitive that we can then recommend to the staff to forward on to the council.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, the direction I've got right now is for the meeting on the 22nd, we'll have the ordinance obviously there, and we'll try to address the missing middle component. But we will bring back to you the data of our existing housing stock, the affordable housing stock. We will deliver to you some census data if we have it and we've been able to unpackage it. And third, we'll try to invite people that are in the business of affordable housing building. We could possibly, I'm thinking of having Adam Cooperman from Saha talk to us about affordable housing. He's been very helpful in the past on some issues and questions that we've had. So that's okay with the chair, we'll do that.
All right.
You have a
The
motion.
chair, was there a second on the motion that Larry Barnett made?
I second.
Okay, any further discussion? Jim, you have comment or discussion?
This doesn't relate to the motion, so I'd like to make a comment if I can after that, but relative to the next meeting.
Okay, we had a first and a second. Can we have a roll call, please?
Vice Chair Barnett?
Aye.
Commissioner Bohar?
Aye.
Commissioner Felder?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Neill?
Yes.
And Chair Wellender?
Yes.
Thank you. The motion passes unanimously.
All right. Now we're moving to items for discussion, and I'm going to just take the first one. The reason for the April 22nd special meeting was also to give consideration to amending a use permit for the SOS
Haven.
Haven facility there just north of the police station. And there is an opportunity that there's an opportunity for I believe it's a grant that would do some significant improvements, but there's a timeline or time limit on that. And hence the request was to bring it forth on the 22nd. And now with what we've discussed regarding the inclusionary, the affordable housing, seems like we'd have then just 2 agenda items for April 22nd. So we did take a straw vote or a motion, not a motion, but indicate who would be available. So I do believe we have a quorum. And so is there anything else you want to add to that, D2?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. It is a project being performed by the Public Works Department. They received, they're about to receive a grant for $295,000, which will be for basic ADA improvements, showers, and facilities of that like. And there's a time crunch of having the work completed by the end of this fiscal year. So the City Council will be entertaining a resolution or approval of some kind at the next City Council meeting, I believe, on May 3rd. Sorry. Thank you.
All right, I saw that, Jan. Sheila, is there anything else so we can wrap up?
I believe Commissioner Mohawk wanted to say something about
sorry.
it.
Yes, Jim.
I'm not sure whether this is in line or not, but I have a hunch that there's going to be a great deal of controversy about that Havens expansion. And it may have a lot of public involvement. Whether that matters to the schedule, I don't know. But that subject has come up before the last couple of years, and there's been a great deal of public controversy. And I think it's going to go to that meeting. Excuse me. Thank you.
Chair, if I could just make a correction there. It's not an expansion. It's an amendment to the existing use permit to recognize the uses that are presently there. And I know that the Haven folks and the SOS folks are talking with community members as to legitimize the uses that are there, or maybe even scaling them back from what they are. So hopefully the impacts will be less on the community.
Okay, well, it'll be what it is then. I understand.
Yeah, we were certainly aware of the community input that we had over there at the Veterans Hall, I think about a year ago, just over a year ago, before COVID hit. And that's the basis for coming to the commission for an amendment for that use.
Okay. So D2, any issues update?
Not an issue, but some good news. The Times and Leisure magazine provided its top 10 small communities in California under 15,000 people, and we came in at number 8. So we got some work to do, but way to go, Sonoma.
Very good.
That's all I have.
All right. Any other comments from my fellow commissioners?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Larry.
I just want to say that, and I'm just going to throw this out there as a curiosity of mine and to prompt perhaps some thinking on the part of the commission. When I moved to Sonoma 30 years ago and got involved with the first general plan process, the underlying foundational principle of all of the discussion that took place had to do with the sense of place, defining it, preserving it, trying to figure out how it manifested in a physical form and culturally as a community, and everything about the first general plan I was involved with in the early 90s was focused on this notion of a sense of place. And that language, you can actually see the derivation of it in what Christina read tonight, which had to do with small town character and the preservation of the unique qualities of Sonoma. We're now faced with a very strange situation in my position, in that the state has basically said now when it comes to the zoning ordinance, or what we used to call the development code, the subjective language, which deals effectively with matters of sense of place, quality, characteristics, small town feel, the undefinable, unquantifiable qualities of Sonoma, have now been eliminated by the state as legitimate criteria for project evaluation. And so what I want to just throw out for your thinking between now and some subsequent meeting as we get into the development code and the zoning ordinance and the general plan is there a way, is it possible to develop subjective language that retains, objective language that retains some of the subjective goals that have been so much a part of the history and the development of this community in the past. And I'll just leave it at that. I think it's a very complicated, very difficult thing to do. But nonetheless, we can do it where things are in the historic district. You can actually have a discussion about aesthetics and feel and sense of place. But that isn't and doesn't cover the entire town. So I just put that out there as a topic I'm interested in. I've had some conversations with some architects. They're as befuddled by the concept as I am, as how you create objective language to cover subjective criteria. But that's my challenge, so I'll put it out there.
Very good. Anyone else? Now, I'm going to put Sheila on the spot. Would you like to make a motion that we stop?
You talking to me?
No, Sheila.
I make a motion that we adjourn tonight's meeting and we all get to go relax.
Perfect. Is there a second?
Second.
I'm not going to allow discussion. We're just going to do it. All in favor?
And send Christina off on vacation.
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, aye, aye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christina.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Ron.